Done. So last time we covered the actual kinds of cardiovascular disease, right? We talked about coronary artery disease, strokes, okay, congestive heart failure, peripheral arterial disease. We talked about hypertension or high blood pressure. We covered the kinds of things that are out there, all right? So to finish kind of this section of things, and then to move us into doing diabetes, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what are the things that we can control from an exercise standpoint. Okay, what are the things that we can control? So I put a list up here. Does this list look familiar to you, Emma? Yes. Okay. What does it look like? Where have you seen these kinds of things before? In the last lecture. Okay. Okay. So, Daniel, what about these? These are the ACSM risk factors for exercise, right? We did this with the health appraisal. Do you remember, what are we worried about? Why do we need to ask people about these things before we have them exercise? The risk level of what? Myocardial infarction. It's okay, it's a tough word, right? What does that mean? Heart attack, right? Are you going to have a heart attack while you're exercising? Okay. We've got our 7: family history, smoking, okay, sedentary lifestyle, elevated fasting blood glucose, elevated cholesterol and LDL, high blood pressure, and obesity. Okay. All right. These are the risk factors. If we're worried about somebody doing this, these are specifically the risk factors for coronary artery disease, which is the big thing that plays into what's going to happen with having some kind of side effects. Okay. Here's what I want everybody to do. Okay. If you're in class, close your notes, close your notebooks. I'm going to put you guys in groups together. We're going to do something. If you are on Zoom, I'm going to put you guys into breakout rooms together. And we are going to play through with that. Okay. So I'm creating the breakout rooms. Before you guys hop in, here's what you're going to do. Here's why you've got to have your notes closed. Okay. Look at these 7 things and tell me which of these things do you think it's possible that being more active or exercising can have some sort of a positive impact. Okay? If these are things that are going to put me at a greater risk of having a heart attack or having some kind of cardiovascular disease, which ones can exercise positively affect? Okay? So jump into breakout rooms. When you're done, come back. All right? So I'm going to open all the rooms. In the chat. Y'all like the test question where I gave the person every possible risk factor?
Yeah.
And literally 90% of y'all were like, yep, they're high. They're a high risk person. And I was like, no, they're not high. What? Because they don't have any known diagnosed disease or signs or symptoms. I made a big show in class that day. Like, it doesn't matter how many they have, right? So that is what Lauren's thing reminded me of. It seems like the conceit is this, okay?
I put high and then I'm just like, that's a trick question.
Right? It's not a trick. It's not a trick.
Must have zoned out. That happened.
All right, we'll go back to the video. There's video evidence of all of
Listen, not gonna lie, sometimes I do be zoning out.
it's okay. I see you guys zone out in class, right? Okay. I see you guys when you're shopping for other things during class, when you're studying for a different class like I did. All right, everybody back to your seats. You can open your notes up.
I'll
Okay.
just catch you back up on this.
Sometimes like you just get fixated.
It's not a personal attack, Madison.
I'm just saying.
Okay. So several of you guys in class, you guys said all of them, okay? All of them. And that seems like a reasonable thing that I would do, but it is in fact not the case, okay? It's not the case. Many of them will do this, okay? But not quite all. Okay. Of our 7, okay, clearly, if you are more active, you're not going to be sedentary. That seems reasonable, right? We haven't talked about it, but we will get way more into it later on today. Impaired or elevated fasting glucose levels, your symptoms of being a pre-diabetic. Of all of the things on here, this may be the one that is the most powerfully affected by being more active, okay? If you exercise, you can lower LDL cholesterol, you can lower your blood pressure, and I know we really kind of waved our hands about it, but there's a chance that exercising could lower your BMI. You could, in theory, lose weight from exercise. You don't have to, there's lots of benefits without it, but it's a possible kind of thing, right? So of all of the things that are here, what we're really getting at is exercise can't alter your family history, despite whatever Riley and Daniel were trying to twist themselves into a pretzel about, okay? Yes, exercise affects these other ones and therefore may overcome your family history, fine. It's a nice parsing of words, okay? And generally, exercising does not have any effects on smoking, okay? If we look epidemiologically, people that are more active tend to be less prone to smoking, just like people that don't smoke tend to generally eat a better diet than people that smoke. It's about a health-related behavior thing, but it doesn't directly have an impact on smoking, okay? So 5 of 7 risk factors can be positively affected, okay? This is a good thing, okay? This is a good thing. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna work our way through on which of these risk factors that can be impacted by being more active or by exercising, how these things are going to specifically affect each individual disease, okay? Each individual disease. So it looks like from looking through the chat that for the most part, those of you guys on Zoom also did very well, if not relatively similar things, okay? Okay, so let's talk about what happens with cholesterol, okay? Let's talk about cholesterol. Remember that having elevated cholesterol levels not only is a risk factor, but where it really comes into play is with atherosclerosis, okay? Because you're going to get these LDL deposits as part of the development of atherosclerosis. So you guys ever tried to put, and I'm sure you have, okay? You ever try to put like cooking oil into water and see what happens? Anybody ever done that? It wants to separate, right? You guys have, anybody ever used cooking oil? It's cooked on occasion, yes. If not, go home, get a little bit of cooking oil and pour it into a cup and put some water in there, and it separates, okay? Fat and water don't mix, okay? Fats are what we call hydrophobic. They're afraid of water. They're not going to mix in together. You can't dissolve one in the other. Okay. When I was I don't know if I told you guys this or not, but when I was a postdoc and we gave people ginger, we found that you could increase absorption if you gave them a little bit of fat while they were doing it. So we would give them like a shot of olive oil. And because that was what was encouraged for us to do, we found that just taking a shot of olive oil was not the world's most pleasant thing. And so we mixed it with water and made a big show of trying to like mix them together. And it was just a shot of olive oil. And then there was like a water chaser. It's really all that it was. But I will never forget, like, you know, we would do all of that and you'd have just this oil sitting on top of the water. I say all of this to try to get you guys to understand what LDL is, okay? LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. HDL stands for high density lipoprotein. And these things exist to help us move fat and move cholesterol around in the blood. Your blood is a majority water, okay? So lipoproteins are protein particles that transport cholesterol and triglycerides. If we did not have these, the fat would get into your blood and it would just sit there, okay? You couldn't move it around, it couldn't go anywhere. So when we move fats, we're going to move them bound to LDL or HDL, or something called VLDL, which stands for very low density lipoproteins, okay? Or in things that are called chylomicrons. Chylomicrons are just little balls of fat, okay? It's lipid on the inside, and then things that have charges on them that sort of form this reverse circle around them, so that little ball of fat can actually exist in the water and be able to move around, okay? That's in essence what a chylomicron is. So when we look at this, okay, you have LDL cholesterol. You've got these cholesterol molecules and triglycerides bound onto LDL floating around in your bloodstream. These are the ones that are very prone to getting stuck into the inside of the endothelium on your coronary arteries. And so if we want to lower these or change the ratio of these things with exercise, essentially what we need to do is we just need to burn more energy. If we burn more energy, we use more calories, we will break down the LDL, and as they get broken down, they in essence become HDL. So your LDL goes down and your HDL goes up, okay? If we look at these things, the way we study this, and I got to be a part of several of these studies when I was a grad student at Georgia, is you look at people in what we call a postprandial state. Postprandial is just a big fancy word that means after you've given them something to eat, okay? And so when you would study these things, we would come in first thing in the morning, you haven't had anything to eat, and you would sit down and they would give you a high-fat meal, which at the time was this giant like sausage, bacon, egg, and cheese, like triple croissant thing from Burger King. Burger King at one point, their whole shtick was like, we're going to have the worst possible for you, the largest cheeseburger kind of thing, was the anti-health message. You know, but it was like 1,800 calories and it was all fat and all of this. So you eat this very, very high fat meal. And then you would look at, after all of this, for like a period of 6 hours, you just got to sit around and watch movies. You would look at the appearance of triglycerides, HDL, and LDL into your bloodstream as it was all being absorbed. And so what we see is that if you do a bout of exercise and then you go eat, that postprandially, LDL goes down, HDL goes up, okay? Triglyceride levels go down. So if you eat the exact same thing, if you exercise beforehand, you're going to have less of an LDL response and more of an HDL response. Okay? And so what we know then, this lasts for a couple of days. If you exercise every couple of days, you're always in this exercise-related postprandial state. And so you chronically then elevate HDL and lower LDL. Okay? That's what we're going to end up having happen. Okay? What we think happens is that you use the body's energy stores. So this is the big key thing. You see this change in lipid profile after both aerobic exercise and resistance exercise, but it seems to be a little bit more pronounced after aerobic exercise. It happens with walking, it happens with running, it happens with biking. It seems that the thing that's the best predictor is the total number of calories that are burned during that bout of exercise. Okay? And what happens is exercise stimulates an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. Okay? And lipoprotein lipase breaks down LDL. Okay? And so we metabolize these things down to replenish our energy stores, and the cholesterol ends up going on to HDL rather than the other. Okay? That's what's happening. So exercise is good for your lipid profiles. Alternatively, they can put you on the world's most widely prescribed medications, which are called statins. Okay, Lipitor, Crestor, the kind of the non-generic names of these drugs, and statins do basically the exact same thing. Okay, they put my mom on a statin 6 weeks ago, and her LDL levels have gone down like 70 milligrams per deciliter in like 6 weeks. Okay, now the statin drugs come with a host of side effects that can be pretty nasty, so we just kind of have to keep all this. Okay. So if I lower LDL in my blood, there's less of a chance that they can get stuck into these atherosclerotic plaques, and therefore there's less of a chance that I can develop coronary artery or peripheral vascular disease. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about blood pressure. Exercise lowers your blood pressure. That's it. That's the story. We don't know why, we don't know how, but it lowers it. Okay. We have Phoebe go do a bout of exercise, and if she is hypertensive, her blood pressure is going to go down maybe 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Doesn't matter. We don't really understand it. Some of it may be from reductions in sympathetic nervous system activity. Some of it may be from long-term vascular remodeling where the blood vessels get bigger, okay? And that lowers the pressure in them, but we don't really know, okay? And in some ways it doesn't matter, right? Who cares if we know why it goes down? What we do know is it goes down, okay? It goes down. If you've got normal blood pressure, you're not going to change it. It's not going down any further. It's just going to stay kind of where it is. But it may prevent an increase in blood pressure as you age. Okay? That's what we know about blood pressure. Okay. So what I want to show you guys here, okay, these are some older data. This is going to relate to BMI and obesity. Okay. Now, these were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2007. We continue to follow this general pattern. Okay. And so what we have here is, right, we've got cardiovascular disease, deaths, okay, and then what you're going to see here is going to basically be all-cause mortality here. What you see is we've got a relative risk. You've got the different BMI categories here on the y-axis, and you've got 25 to 60, 60 to 70, and greater than 70. Okay? And what you see from all of this is, in essence, if we make the 18.5 to 25 BMI range our reference category, what I want you guys to see is, in these age ranges, as it relates to cardiovascular disease deaths, what happens as BMI goes up, okay? And so the takeaway, for the most part, should be pretty simple, right? And this is a little bit counter to some of the earlier data that I've shown you guys, but if you're in the 25 to 30, kind of your overweight by BMI, there's not really a lot of increase in cardiovascular disease death risk. There's a small increase in all-cause mortality risk. But when you reach obesity and then even get a BMI over 35, right, then it begins to go up and up. These things are less pronounced in the people that are over 70 because more people over 70 in the normal weight range are dying anyway, and so the numbers get a little bit skewed. Okay? But again, this is just trying to illustrate the stuff that we kind of hopefully hammered home, that within, okay, within an age range, having a higher BMI is potentially risky, especially as we get into over 30, and we get into the level of being obese by BMI. Okay. Here are some of the few data that are out there. You guys had asked before about people that have BMI ranges. Okay, these are people that are normal with BMI, but we have actual DEXA-derived percent body fat. Okay, and so this is going to break people. We're putting them into tertiles. So this is 3 groups. Okay, normal BMI, low body fat. Normal BMI, the gray is kind of the mid body fat, and then normal BMI, and then the black is the highest possible body fat while still being in that normal BMI range. Okay, and so this is the risk of metabolic syndrome, diabetes. I want you guys to look at hypertension, dyslipidemia, so elevated LDL, and then cardiovascular disease risk. Okay, and so here we're going to have, right, this is just simply looking at waist circumference, and we can kind of get the same story out of waist circumference, which is why we did the waist to hip ratio, which is why this is kind of the same thing. But again, normal BMI, so these things aren't particularly prevalent, but within a given BMI range, having more body fat is going to raise your risk of pretty much everything. It's going to raise your risk of pretty much everything. And that's kind of where we're going to fall with these things. Okay. Okay. We talked about this. Okay. So again, coronary artery disease. How does exercise reduce our risk? It lowers blood pressure. It improves lipid profiles. Okay. It improves endothelial function and systemic inflammation, which we haven't really talked about. It's really beyond the scope of our class. Okay. You get more coronary arteries, and the heart doesn't have to work as hard. So in essence, the exercise improves almost all of the things that are part of the etiology of the development of this thing. Okay, stroke. Let's look at stroke. Blood pressure goes down, better LDL profile, inflammation goes down, endothelial function improves. So much like coronary artery disease, you're going to see the same pattern in the most part of these things. When you lower blood pressure, when you lower LDL cholesterol, these are going to be some of the big drivers. Okay. So with moderate activity, we find that the relative risk of stroke goes down about 20%. Okay. So if you can just be like meeting the aerobic guidelines, if you're a high active person, right, so you're well over the aerobic guidelines, about a 25% decrease in the relative risk of having a stroke. Okay. So pretty significant kinds of things, pretty significant. Okay. So hypertension, people that are going to go from being active to inactive, their chances of having high blood pressure goes up by about a third. Okay. By about a third. When you exercise, your blood vessels get bigger, decrease sympathetic nervous system activity, and these things are going to lead to lower pressure inside those peripheral vessels. Okay. Lower pressure. That's going to be a good. If we look at peripheral vascular disease or peripheral arterial disease, there's almost no data. Okay, almost no data on all of this. What we do seem to know is that about 75% of deaths from people that have peripheral vascular disease come from coronary artery disease. So if you've got it in your coronary arteries, you're probably going to have it in your peripheral arteries as well. And so we know that exercise leads to these improvements in coronary artery things. And so we're gonna have positive impacts on the kind of primary thing that kills people that have it. Okay. So We know that high blood pressure and diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, are the major risk factors for developing PVD. And so, as you guys will see, right, we know that exercise affects hypertension, and you guys are going to see some data here pretty soon on the extent to which it's going to affect diabetes. And so that's going to be, that's going to also be good for us. Okay. Okay. Right. So what I'm going to do. Okay. So once again, right, back to all of the scary obesity stats. I know we've shown you guys these before, right? We know that somewhere between 70 and 75% of the adult population, per the question on our last test, is overweight by BMI. Somewhere north of a third of the adult population is obese by BMI. Remember, you guys get counted in that adult population. So of the rest of us, it's like half. Okay? We know that obesity has gone up markedly in kids since 1980. We already talked about the stat, right? That you're all going to put on a half to a pound a year between 25 and 45. Yay, team, here we go. Okay. And that there's this huge, like $150 billion healthcare and lost work productivity cost of obesity. Okay. I am hopeful that you guys appreciate why obesity is so prevalent and why it is so bad. But what we're going to get now really and truly is it's not just having the excess weight all by itself that's the problem. Okay. That's not the real problem. The problem is I have the excess weight that puts me at an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and puts me at an increased risk, especially of diabetes. Okay. So here are, and I think I've shown this before, but here are some kind of common adult onset chronic disease kinds of things, right? Arthritis, coronary artery disease, hypertension, stroke, gallstones, kind of common stuff, all right? And then type 2 diabetes. Of all of the things, okay, of all of the things that being obese increases your risk of, becoming a type 2 diabetic is the single biggest one. Okay? It's the single biggest one. This is the scourge of Western industrial sort of chronic disease culture. Okay? Especially the American version, especially the suburban American version, where we drive around in cars and we don't walk, we don't bike, we don't exercise. You go to Scandinavia, you go to a lot of other Northern European countries, you go to places that are more urban, and what you see is people walk, they all ride their bikes everywhere. Okay. These crazy, like blonde, fit people. Okay. One of my best friends in the world, they lived in the Netherlands. He works for FedEx. They've lived in the Netherlands for the past like 4 years, and they don't own a car. They ride a bike everywhere. They walk everywhere, right? There's great public transportation. And so their kids go to school there. They go like outside like every day of the year, even if it's snowing, and they run around and they play. Just a very different kind of cultural thing. And because of that, they have lower rates of all of these things, but especially of type 2 diabetes. Okay? Especially of type 2 diabetes. So my guess is that most of you guys have heard of diabetes before. Okay? You know in some ways what it is. What if you know someone that's diabetic? Okay? Like half of you. Okay. So we're going to get to the two different kinds in just a second, but the idea with diabetes is, regardless of the origin of it, what it is it's a metabolic disease. Your body does not respond to eating carbohydrates correctly. Okay? And so because of all of that, you do not do a good job of taking those carbohydrates that you've eaten and getting them into your muscles, okay, in order to break them down and use them as energy. So Part of that is going to be due to either a lack of production of insulin, or the most common one, okay, which is type 2 diabetes, is you make plenty of insulin, but your cells don't respond correctly to that insulin. Okay? So you can't get the glucose out of the blood and into muscle or fat or liver tissue that's going to be. So that's why it's a metabolic disorder. That's why it's a metabolic disorder. We diagnose diabetes, okay, generally by looking at either the insufficient insulin response or an over response of insulin, and something called hyperglycemia. With hyperglycemia, you have chronically elevated, way elevated resting blood glucose levels. And so because you can't get that glucose out of the blood, right? Now, let's do a little survey. Who in here thinks you've had the worst job in the entire world? Or the worst job of people in class, either as an intern or as some kind of volunteer experience? Kayla, you think you had a bad one?
Yeah.
You want to share with us, please?
I cleaned cabins.
Okay.
for like 3 summers,
Okay.
so that was horrible.
Okay. Cleaning cabins, not very good. Okay. Yes, cleaning anything that's very bad. Anybody think you've done something worse than having to clean cabins? Any of you guys volunteered at like a PT clinic or at a medical facility or anything? Okay. Adriana, what did they let you do when you volunteered?
Well, I have a PT tech.
You're a P. Okay. Well, so you're getting paid, but what do you get to do as a PT tech? You clean a lot. Okay. You help people with exercises. Okay. Riley, you had your hand up.
I do the same thing.
You're PT tech. You're all like the same place or whatever. No, I don't think so. Okay. Anybody have any other experiences? Anybody? Anybody?
Clean bathrooms.
Oh.
They didn't have like janitorial staff, so all the PT techs did everything. We helped
Do they at
clients.
least pay you to clean the bathrooms?
I worked
Okay. I know, but I'm just saying, like, if you're like a volunteer, if you go to do an internship like this summer, and you're going to work with Katie and Megan, and then you're going to get credit for it, and they're going to let you do certain things. One of those things, if you're not getting paid, should not be cleaning the bathrooms. But that's a side note. Okay. Okay. In the until like sort of the early 20th century, you know how we diagnosed people with diabetes? Yes, you drank their urine. Okay. So you think you have a bad job at a medical clinic. Just imagine it's 1900 and you've gone off. I mean, we were still using leeches and things then. We don't really understand a lot of medicine, but somebody had to be the pee tester. Okay. And it was surprising and shockingly accurate. You know what happens when you have chronically elevated blood glucose levels? You filter it at your kidneys. So guess what? Your urine tastes sweeter than it normally would. Okay? Or are you okay?
No, that's so gross.
Okay? You had to drink urine or salt water. One of them is going to kill you, the other one not so much. So just, I'm just saying, I don't think it's not a good thing, but just that's how we would diagnose this. Okay? Is that people had glucose in their urine because they had so much in their blood. Now, how somebody figured out that was the first person to be like, I'm going to drink this urine, and then, oh, well, it tastes different than regular urine. Like I'm unsure of the sort of the history of all of that, but that's a real thing. Okay. And
that means they had that based on what it's supposed to taste like before.
Yeah.
yes, absolutely they did.
That's what's really getting with me.
Yes, someone, right? It's like a wine sommelier, but you're for urine, right? Well, this is what it's supposed to taste like. Oh, and this has, hints of whatever. Okay, we've beaten that one into the ground. All right, okay? So if you think that you've had a bad job, maybe it could be worse. I don't know, okay? I don't know. So that's why we know that hyperglycemia, okay, is kind of the big thing. So there are two primary types of diabetes, okay? There's a third that we will mention, okay, that happens in women that are pregnant called gestational diabetes. But of these two, of type 1 and type 2, here's kind of the primary story, okay? Type 1 diabetes used to be the predominant form of diabetes, okay? In type 1 diabetes, your body has attacked the beta cells and the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. It's an autoimmune disorder. It's attacked those things and it's destroyed the beta cells. You cannot make insulin. Okay? This is what we used to think of as child onset, okay, or it was sometimes called insulin dependent diabetes. Okay? You typically see this come on in people that are kids or teenagers. In some rare instances now, you'll see folks into their early 20s. Okay, but for the most part, this comes on relatively early in life. You don't make insulin, okay? So, Madison, what'd you have for breakfast?
Eggs.
Eggs. Does no one have a
You shouldn't
donut?
have asked the athlete.
I know, but does no one, maybe they ran like, here, have a donut or like something afterwards. Have some white bread. I don't, some toast. Do you like donuts?
No.
Just go away. Just leave. How do you not like a
I
donut?
can only eat one. You have to be specific. Has to have white icing and sprinkles. I can only eat one.
Okay, well, I will bring donuts for everyone but Madison on
Whoa, I
Wednesday.
said a donut with white icing and sprinkles.
Just
She'll
get
have
one, and if someone else takes it, watch it
Right,
go
I will
down.
bring one. Okay, so if you had a donut or anything that had any kind of carbohydrates in it, there's some in your eggs, okay? Right? You eat that, your blood glucose levels go up as that gets absorbed, and then your pancreas would normally release insulin. That insulin goes and it binds to receptors on cells, and then those cells are going to take the glucose out of your blood and into those cells. If you're a type 1 diabetic, you never make the insulin. You eat something, blood glucose goes up, and then nothing happens, okay? And then nothing happens. So these days, if you're a type 1 diabetic, you probably have an insulin pump. It's constantly monitoring your blood glucose levels. And then when they begin to go up, then it gives you a little bit of insulin. Now, if you don't have insurance, buying that insulin is more than a mortgage payment every month. Okay? It's outrageously expensive. Okay? And that's a whole separate issue about other things. We can talk about why drug companies basically holding people's life for ransom, but c'est la vie. In a type 2 diabetic, and unfortunately, these are the people, this is about 95% of all diabetics now are type 2. Okay. You're fine. Your pancreas works fine. Okay. Riley eats something, her blood glucose goes up, her pancreas releases plenty of insulin, but the tissues, specifically muscle, that normally respond to the insulin are like, no, we're good. That's not enough. Okay. I don't need that. And so then what happens in response? Your blood glucose stays up. She has to release more and more and more and more insulin to get even a small effect of lowering her blood glucose levels. Okay? Her cells become less sensitive, or what we call insensitive to the insulin. Now, eventually, over 10s and 20s and 30s of years of being a type 2 diabetic, her pancreas may eventually give out and she won't make insulin anymore. Okay. That's what it means to be type 2. Okay. You make insulin, but you don't respond to it correctly. But you end up in the same place. You end up with glucose not leaving the bloodstream and staying elevated. So you are in some way starving those cells of carbohydrate, and then all of that gets filtered at the kidneys, and so then the poor urine tasters like food is tasty. Sweet. Okay, so we think that about 26 million Americans, probably Now between 26 and 30, it varies from year to year. So somewhere between maybe 8 and 10% of the adult population have diabetes, one form or the other. Okay? One form or the other. There's probably another maybe 80 million people that are what we call pre-diabetic. Okay? What this means is if we look at their fasting blood glucose levels, they're a little bit high. And what that tells us is that their tissues are on the way to being insensitive to insulin. Okay? Madison gets a response, but it's not quite as good as it should be. And that tells us that there's a very good chance that at some point, that's going to keep getting worse and she will eventually become a type 2 diabetic. Okay? There's about 150 to 160 million diabetics worldwide. These numbers have exploded over the last 30 or 40 years. Okay? We think that number has doubled since 1980. Okay? We think it's going to double again by 2035 or thereabouts. Okay? We're going to get to a place where, you know, a third or some ridiculous amount, 25 to 30% of the adult population in Western industrialized countries are diabetic. Okay? This is not good. It's not good. Okay? $175 billion in direct and indirect healthcare costs, a lot of that being spent on insulin and on treating all of the attendant consequences in the folks that are type 2. And let me just tell you, the consequences of being diabetic, the circulation issues, things that happen in the kidneys, in your eyes, they are really horrific. Okay? They're really goes well beyond just you can't properly regulate your glucose metabolism. It's the secondary consequences that are really bad. Okay? All right, so you can just see these things that are kind of going up. This is from about 2008. The numbers are a little bit higher in each group now, but the trend is roughly the same. Right? Estimated percentage of people aged 20 or older with diagnosed or undiagnosed diabetes. So these are a little higher, but you can kind of see this. Much like what we see with coronary artery disease and atherosclerosis and high blood pressure, diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, is a disease of age. Okay? It takes a long time to develop. In these folks that are 20 to 44, the vast majority of that sort of 3 or 4% of the population that have it, almost all of those people are type 1 diabetics. Okay? Almost all of them are type 1 diabetics. So just take this 3.5% or thereabouts, subtract that portion out of these other ones, and then everything above that is your type 2. Okay? Generally, we don't see type 2 diabetic people that develop that until their mid 40s or their early 50s, and then a lot of times into your 60s and 70s. Okay? It really comes on with age, and we have some ideas as to why that's the case, but we don't fully understand. Okay? I like these because they're the maps. Okay, the top set of maps is obesity rates, 94, 2000, 2009, and then the ones on the bottom are the rates of diabetes. And so what I hope you see from all of this is that especially type 2 diabetes, what happens is it tracks with obesity. When obesity rates go up, the next thing that happens is type 2 diabetes levels are going to go up. Okay? And so that's the kind of the big consequence of all of these things. Here are county level adjustments, and I can only get these. They stopped doing these things in the early 2010s. So here's some data from the year was from 2007. Goodness gracious. But you can look at all of this, okay? Here's the diabetes rates. The darker the color, the higher the rates, okay? Look at it through Appalachia and the Southeast. Look at it here. And I don't know if anybody knows, if we were to look at the individual counties in Oklahoma where it's the most prevalent, okay, a lot of those are on Native American. So those are Native American areas with higher concentrations of Native Americans. We will see type 2 diabetes seems to disproportionately affect Native Americans, okay, African Americans, and Hispanics compared to those of sort of Caucasian European descent and those of Asian descent. Okay. And some of that goes back to obesity, some of it goes back to lifestyle factors and some things, but it's a real phenomenon. Okay. So there's diabetes, there's obesity, right? You can say okay. Here are, and I really wish the CDC would go back to doing this, but it's really cool. Here are counties in the top and bottom 2 quintiles. So in the sort of top 40% of having the most obesity and the most diabetes, and then the bottom 40% of diabetes and those things. And so what you can see, blue counties are places that are in the bottom 40%. Black counties are those that are in the top 40%. If you look at all of this, right, like what you see is it's just kind of really brings the other things into stark contrast. As you can see, a lot of Oklahoma, here in sort of eastern Arizona, western New Mexico, these are again kind of areas high in Native American populations, and then all across the southeast and Appalachia. Okay, we're going to get along the same passage. Okay. So, again, this just shows the relationship I hope that you guys will be getting to understand between obesity and diabetes. Okay, so I assume and maybe wrongly, you guys in human phys, you guys have a thing, we talk about endocrinology, you guys talk about how insulin works and all of that. You guys have maybe seen that before. I'm going to believe Emma's nodding her head. Okay, so the thing that happens, okay, you release insulin. It goes into your blood and it binds to receptors on muscle. Muscle has insulin receptors. The liver has insulin receptors. Adipose tissue has insulin receptors. Okay. And they're going to signal those tissues when the insulin binds to bring glucose into those cells, out of the blood into the cells. And they do that via a protein that is a glucose receptor called GLUT4. I want you guys to know GLUT4. Okay. So we could have Lauren stand up. She could be an insulin molecule. She can wander around in the classroom, right? Bind to a receptor. And then that's going to tell those cells that have these GLUT4 molecules stored inside them to move the GLUT4 out to the membrane of the cell to grab glucose out of the blood. Okay. So if I'm a type 1 diabetic, I don't get GLUT4 to the membrane because I don't make any insulin. If I'm a type 2 diabetic, I got plenty of insulin, it binds to receptors, and then something happens. Okay. The receptors don't tell the GLUT4 or don't tell as much GLUT4 as it should to move to the muscle membrane or the membrane on the liver. Okay. So I have to keep releasing more and more insulin to get my blood glucose to go down. Okay. All right. Now, we have a pretty good sense of all of these little intracellular signals. You guys don't have to know this. Okay. But here, this is going to be a capillary. This is the membrane of, say, a muscle fiber. You've got blood in the capillary. You've got insulin in the capillary. It binds to its receptor. And then we're going to get this signaling cascade through something called ERS1, right? Boom, boom, boom. It's going to eventually come down here and tell these vesicles with GLUT4 to go to the membrane and bring in the glucose. Okay. So something gets broken downstream of the insulin receptor in people that are type 2 diabetics. Okay. We haven't figured that out yet. Someday, somebody will win a Nobel Prize. Not quite worth all of those things. Okay. So the way that we test this, the way that we would know if you have proper insulin signaling, we can do one of two things. We can do what you guys do, or what you guys did if you took human physiology here, and you did something called a glucose tolerance test. You guys remember that? somebody in your little lab group, you drank a little sugary drink, and you did a finger stick, right? You got a drop of blood, and you measured how much glucose was in that blood. Okay. A glucose tolerance test, you give someone a known amount of glucose, and you see how much of it appears and then disappears from your blood in a 2-hour period of time. And this will tell us something about the underlying function of insulin and its receptors and your body's ability to clear blood glucose. Okay? And so what you do with this is people that have better insulin sensitivity, have better function, are going to clear out more. Their blood glucose goes up and then it comes back down faster than a person that has worse glucose tolerance. Okay? That's how that test is going to work. Okay? The other way that we can test things is to look at actual, what we call insulin sensitivity. And so in doing this, we give you a known amount of glucose and then we give you a known amount of insulin. And we see for that given amount of insulin, how much glucose do we clear. Okay. And so this is typically has to be done in a hospital. You have to run arterial and venous catheters. It's called a insulinic clamp. And they basically clamp and they give you a certain amount of insulin. That's the best way for us to test our sensitivity. Okay. What we do now, to be honest, is do the finger stick and measure something called hemoglobin A1C, which is glycosylation. So it's these little sugar molecules that have been put on the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. Hemoglobin A1C represents kind of how much glucose have your red blood cells been exposed to over, say, the past month to 2 months. Okay. And so if you have chronically elevated blood glucose levels, which would be suggestive that you don't have good insulin sensitivity, then your A1C is going to be high. It's a much more stable number. Okay. Like the last time I went to my doctor, they wanted to run blood work on me, and they of course didn't tell me beforehand, so I had eaten breakfast, and they measured things, and I had elevated glucose levels because I'd eaten an hour before. Okay. And they're like, well, we don't really know. This could mean that you're like a diabetic. And I'm like, why don't we check something else? And they looked at my A1C values and they're like, oh, those are perfectly normal. Fine. So that's why we're going to look at those things. Okay. So that's kind of how we would measure and look at all of this. So who becomes diabetic? If you're a type 1 person, it's an autoimmune disorder. There's some genetics to all of this. There's some family history to all of this. Unfortunately, it's just kind of the luck of the draw. Okay. To be type 2, it is in some ways genetic. Okay, but about 80% of people that are type 2 diabetic are overweight or obese at onset. They have an abdominal fat distribution. Okay, this is why measuring waist circumference can be so useful. They're older in age, they're sedentary. This is a big one we're going to talk about in a second. They have high blood pressure and they have elevated LDLs. Okay, but the elevations in blood pressure and high LDL is very much related to obesity and this abdominal fat distribution. We know that as we age, obesity tends to go up. As we age, we tend to become more sedentary. So there's this big interaction of all of these different things. Okay. Now, this used to be more of a thing. I feel like we talk about it less now, but they used to talk about something called metabolic syndrome, or what they would refer to as metabolic syndrome X, because they're like, oh, we don't really know what this is. We know very clearly now what it is. And it's a clustering of people that are type 2 diabetic, they have high blood pressure, they're obese, and they have elevated cholesterol levels. Okay. And so basically they're type 2 diabetic and they have cardiovascular disease, which is essentially like half of all adults in the US now. Okay. That's what's called metabolic syndrome and metabolic syndrome. That's just this clustering of all of these different kinds of things because they share all of the same risk factors. Okay. So if you are a diabetic, what are the things we need to worry about? Okay. Well, there are two things. We can acutely worry about you having elevated blood glucose levels or very, very low blood glucose levels. Of these two, It's the low blood glucose levels that are going to be the most dangerous. And this is most prevalent in people that are type 1 diabetics. Okay. I'm a type 1 diabetic and I just took a shot of insulin. I better make sure that I just ate something. Okay. Or I'm a type 1 diabetic and I'm going to go and exercise. I should probably eat a candy bar beforehand or have some Gatorade beforehand. Because what happens is if your blood glucose falls too far, your brain shuts everything down. The brain runs on glucose, okay, primarily on glucose. When glucose gets too low, the brain will put you into a coma in an effort to lower your metabolic rate and stop using blood glucose. So if you become hypoglycemic, you may pass out, you may go into a coma, and it may kill you. Okay? And so people that are hypoglycemic, if you guys have any friends, you know anyone's type 1 diabetic, if their blood glucose gets too low, that happens a lot, like first thing in the morning before they've had breakfast or anything like all of that. They may have a lot of confusion, kind of mental fog. They may seem very tired, very fatigued. They may be unsure of kind of where they are and what's going on, how hard they're talking. This whole host of different things. Okay? I have on several occasions had type 1 diabetics in class, and they would warn me, right, we had class first thing in the morning, and they would warn me, like, look, I got a candy bar, I got these things always in my bag, and sometimes in the mornings I forget to eat or whatever, because, you know, we all forget to eat sometimes, and they wouldn't monitor it very well, and they would get kind of spaced out in class, and we'd have to sort of pause and get them to eat something or get them something to drink, and try to make sure that they were good. All right? The chronic complications, a lot of these things are most likely going to happen in the people that are hyperglycemic, they're type 2. So if I'm type 2, I run around all the time with these chronically elevated blood glucose levels. That is going to cause cardiovascular diseases, and it's going to cause blindness, and we call neuropathies. And the blindness is from neuropathies. So what happens is the high levels of glucose in my blood raise my blood pressure. As my blood pressure is raised, and then that blood has a lot of glucose in it, it causes damage to nerves, especially small nerves in the periphery and in the eyes and in and around the kidneys. Okay? The leading cause of adult onset blindness is uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. Okay? You can have macrovascular, so big blood vessel damage, coronary artery disease, peripheral vascular disease from type 2 diabetic very often, or what we call microvascular, so it damages the capillaries and that damages the nerves. So you get retinopathies and nephropathies, so retinopathies, right, from the retina to your eyes and to the neurons, or the nephrons, sorry, that go to your kidneys. Adult onset kidney failure, a lot of it is from type 2 diabetes. You go blind, your kidneys don't work. Let me just tell you, if your kidneys don't work, you have to be on dialysis. This is one of the worst things. Like, we can keep you alive, they can do things for you, but it is no way to have to live. And then you also see what are called neuropathies. This is nerve damage. Diabetic neuropathies tend to happen in the hands and the feet. Okay, and you get these nerves that just die. When that happens, sometimes it's excruciatingly painful, like so painful morphine doesn't, like it burns and it shoots. Morphine doesn't stop it. Okay, the nerves get damaged and they just fire uncontrollably. Okay, and also because of that, it's either going to hurt really bad, or conversely, they may become numb. When they get numb and you can't feel things, you leave your foot like sitting in the fireplace or something. Like, I'm not kidding on these things. We have one of our spinal cord injured guys that like burned his foot because he couldn't feel anything. Right? So you get numbness, you get some stuff, really, really terrible consequences. You have poor circulation, your wounds don't heal. It's a really, really bad kind of thing. Okay? Really, really bad. You don't want to be a type 2 diabetic, doesn't have things. Okay. Now, there's one thing that we can do that will keep you from becoming a type 2 diabetic. Or if you are a type 2 diabetic, that will go a long way to controlling it and treating it. You know what that is? Exercise. Okay? Regardless of your other risk factors. if you meet the physical activity guidelines, your chances of becoming type 2 diabetic, they're not zero, but they're way, way, way low. Okay, way low. Because a single bout of exercise for about 48 hours, if you go for a run, or you go for a walk, or you lift weights, whatever you're doing, one bout of exercise gives you about 48 hours of improved glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. Okay? So if you're a person that goes to exercise every couple of days, you are chronically going to be in a state where you're more sensitive to insulin and you clear more glucose just from the fact that you've done the exercise. Okay? And so what that means is that you will move more glucose into your cells for a given amount of insulin. Okay? Last 48 to 72 hours, it occurs following any kind of exercise, as I mentioned. Right? These are all going to be good things. So if we look at our risk factors for diabetes, exercise may improve obesity. It may improve blood pressure. We know that it's going to potentially improve the LDL, HDL things. But then the other big thing that it really does, so it affects these risk factors, but what it really does is it very specifically targets the pathology of type 2 diabetes. Okay? It directly counteracts the decrease in insulin sensitivity. Right? You are going to have more GLUT4 transporters in your muscle. You're going to have more insulin receptors in your muscle. You may even increase muscle mass, which means there's more places for that blood glucose to go. More muscle, there's more insulin receptors, there's more GLUT4 receptors. All of this gets better. Okay? I'm not going to say that people that chronically lift weights and that are very active until old age will never become a type 2 diabetic, but it's pretty darn rare. Okay? Regardless of how much they weigh, it's very, very rare. Now, we know that we can't really use exercise to treat or prevent type 1 diabetes. In some ways, exercise is one of the most dangerous things that a type 1 diabetic can do. Okay? You've got to make sure you understand when they've eaten and when they've had insulin. Otherwise, they could become hypoglycemic. Okay? So we've got to be really, really careful. But we know it's really effective for type 2. Okay? It not only targets the pathology, but it reduces some of our risk factors. So, not this, blah, blah, blah. So, it lasts about 48 to 72 hours. People have spent a lot of time looking at all of these kinds of things. So, if you exercise 3+ times per week, that's the general recommendation to improve your glucose control and your insulin sensitivity. Okay? That way, you're never really outside of that 48 to 72 hour window of having improved glucose dynamics. Okay? We've seen chronic exercise training, both aerobic and resistance, leads to all of these kinds of things. How does exercise do this? We don't know. Okay? We don't know. They've been studying it for about 60 years, and they don't know yet. Again, somebody will figure it out and they'll win a Nobel Prize. It will be one of the greatest scientific discoveries in the history of mankind. Okay? But that's what's going to happen. Okay, so I covered all of the diabetes. Questions? If you have or you know someone that is a type 2 diabetic, tell them to go for a walk. Okay? With a level of diet intervention and increases in sort of physical activity and exercise, we can go a long way to controlling people that become a type 2 diabetic. We can do a lot from a treatment standpoint, just from diet and exercise. Okay? Just from diet and exercise. Okay. That's all I got, folks. So on Wednesday, we're going to talk about cancer. Exercise, physical activity, and food. Right? So we will see you then. Please make sure you turn in your assignment from today.